My name's Steve McGuire. I teach in the Augustine Culture Seminar Program here at Villanova University, and I also am the director of the Matthew J. Ryan Center, which is sponsoring tonight's event. The Ryan Center is dedicated to promoting the study of freedom and civic responsibility on campus. If you're interested in learning about future events put on by the Ryan Center, if you didn't see it, we have a table on your way out, and there's a sign-up sheet there where you can add your email to our list if you're so inclined. In the spring, just to give you an idea, we're planning right now a panel with the American Conservative magazine on the future of conservatism, and we also have Jason Riley of the Wall Street Journal scheduled to come speak on Thomas Sowell and race in America. Tonight, our topic is trust and the media. And this event is the Betty and J.J. McAndrews Lecture in American Political Ideas. Betty and Jay are great friends of the Ryan Center, and they had planned to be here tonight, but something came up and they couldn't make it. But we do want to acknowledge them and say that we appreciate their support of the Ryan Center. I'd also like to thank Paul Strid, who's a friend of the Ryan Center and has been doing a lot of work to promote the Ryan Center and help to sponsor this event as well and to get people to come out tonight. So thank you very much, Paul. Paul is with us, sitting in the... I should also thank Jordan Watts, the Assistant Director of the Ryan Center, who's standing at the back. He's the one who actually installed. So tonight, we're very lucky to have with us two distinguished journalists to talk about trust in the media. On my left, your right, we have Mollie Hemingway, who's senior editor at the Federalist and a contributor on Fox News. She's also a senior journalism fellow at Hillsdale College. Mollie was a 2004 recipient of the Robert Novak Journalism Fellowship at the Fund for American Studies and a 2014 Lincoln Fellow at the Claremont Institute, which I hadn't mentioned to you, but I was a Claremont Fellow this past summer, so I guess things have gone downhill a little bit there. She's the author of several books, including Justice on Trial, The Kavanaugh Confirmation, and the Future of the Supreme Court. And most recently, out just about a month now, I think, Rigged, How the Media, Big Tech, and the Democrats Seized Our Elections. So Mollie, thank you for being with us tonight. On my right is Matt Taibbi, formerly of The Exile in Moscow, I had to mention that, as well as Rolling Stone magazine, where he worked for a number of years until just recently. He now runs TK News on Substack, which you can access by going to taibbi.substack.com. I highly recommend that. And he also has a weekly podcast, Useful Idiots, that he does with Katie Halper. Matt won a National Magazine Award for columns and commentary in 2008 for 3 columns that he wrote for Rolling Stone. And he's the author of numerous books, including The Great Derangement, Grifftopia, The Divide, Insane Clown President, I Can't Breathe, and perhaps most relevant to tonight's discussion, Hate Inc. So Matt, thank you also for being with us tonight. All right, so the way we'll proceed tonight is I'll ask questions of Matt and Mollie, and my job is to just do my best to get them talking, which I don't think will be difficult, and we'll try to go for about an hour or so, and then we'll open things up to questions from the floor for the remainder of the event. So if you have a question, you can be ready for that. So let's go ahead and get started. Matt, maybe I'll start with you. I think you'd agree that the media's approach to political coverage changed significantly with the 2016 election. And so I was wondering if you could start there. And of course, we can talk as we go along about developments previous to that, social media, that sort of thing. But just specifically in terms of mainstream journalists and corporate media, what sort of changes did you notice in 2016?
So to begin with, I covered the presidential election. Is this on?
Weird.
No?
You're okay.
I'm okay. So I covered the presidential election in...
Jordan will fix it.
Oh. No?
Well, keep going. We think about
I'll project. So that was part of my job for Rolling Stone for many years had been to do the old campaign trail beat. So I had covered presidential elections going back to 2004. And in 2015 and 2016, when Donald Trump started to do well on the campaign trail, I started to notice that the journalists who were on the bus, to use the term, like following the candidates around, began having a lot of discussions about how do we cover this figure. And by the summer of 2016, when it became apparent that Trump was going to be the nominee, there was a growing consensus in the press corps that we had to change the way we do business, that Trump was such a unique threat to democracy that that we had to do things differently. And for those of you who are laughing, that this is actually expressed pretty openly. There was a celebrated column in the New York Times that summer by a guy named Jim Rutenberg. And the title of that piece was called "Trump is Testing the Norms of Objectivity in Journalism." And if you read through the piece, what it essentially says is journalists have to I'm paraphrasing, we have to abandon the old notion of just sticking to what's true, and we have to worry about being true to history's judgment. And this was a sort of an overhaul of the traditional, what they now call the objective approach to journalism. It's been denounced by reporters like Wesley Lowery of the Washington Post, who calls the old style view from nowhere journalism, where reporters don't take sides, we just sort of tell you what we see. And essentially what they were saying was that we can't just be sideline actors anymore. The traditional view of how journalism works is that we just give the public the facts, and it's their job to sort out what to do with that. And the new vision, what I think, which changed really very rapidly, I think, in the summer of 2016, was that they can't do that anymore. We have to take a side. And I think it's had a very negative result in the business. I think you can see that people have reacted negatively to it. There's been a precipitous loss in trust in news media. Even though people consume news media more than they ever have before, they trust us less than ever. So that's where I would say it's, from my personal experience, that's where I first noticed the dramatic changes in those discussions, and then, when they first started coming out with it.
Mollie, I'd love to hear your thoughts on 2016 as well, but I'd also like to ask you to maybe talk about the subject of your recent book and the 2020 election, and if do you see the same patterns that Matt's talking about, and have you seen those continuing, getting worse in 2020, or are there new things that you're seeing?
Thank you, first of all. I would also point to the Jim Rutenberg front page August 2016 article that really wait, should I shout more? That he gets in a lot of trouble for having written that, but he really was just articulating what everybody was saying, which is we have to throw out any norms to fight this particular guy. And I think that one of the things that's most interesting about the way the media acted is that there's no debate about how bad it was because Trump won. So we all I think that had Trump lost, I'm very curious whether they would have said, we had to do these horrible things and violate all of our supposed norms and standards, but now we have to go back to pretending that we're objective, and we have to go back to pretending that we are somewhat neutral. I wonder about that. I'm not sure what the answer would have been, but because he won, there was just no question that they had behaved horribly, but it also made for things, I'm just gonna take it off. But what was also interesting about it is that because he won, and because they'd already decided to act this certain way, I think it gave them two options about how to handle themselves following his surprise victory. One would have been to say, that was bad the way we did this. We clearly are out of touch with the electorate because we said there was no chance he would win. We said that the issues that he tapped into were illegitimate, and clearly they're not believing us, and he won, so we need to reevaluate how we report on these people. You know, maybe we should reshape our bureaus. Maybe we should drop the narrative pushing and go back to reporting more facts instead of narration. Maybe we should not promote the people who did the bad things, and we should hire different previously marginalized voices, and we should elevate them. So that would have been one option, and that was what would have made sense to me. And instead they decided that they would just lean into it and get really bad to the point that it's almost unrecognizable. And I say that as someone who was already critical of them in 2016, but where they are right now versus where they were 10 years ago, it's almost unrecognizable. And so that is part of what I deal with in my book, Rigged, which looks at how the media handle news stories, how they will over-rely on anonymous sources, even when those anonymous sources are discredited, how tech companies also reacted to 2016 in very interesting ways. You know, successful campaigns had utilized social media really well from both parties. You know, Barack Obama, there were glowing profiles about how he had used Facebook and other social media companies. When Trump successfully used those companies, it was not glowing profiles, and in fact, all of these tech oligarchs said, we can never let what happened in 2016 happen again. Because the media weren't covering Trump well. Trump and other Republicans used social media to speak directly to people, say that we cannot let that happen. So they sort of set about openly saying that they would game the system. And then I also look at how election laws were changed in the last couple of years. And I happen to focus on Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Georgia, because those were three really interesting states that I did a deep dive into.
Anything you care to Swazi or comment on?
Yeah, I think there are a couple things that are interesting that Mollie talked about. I mean, there are, in addition to the political aspect of what happened in 2016, there was also the financial aspect of what was going on in the business. Trump was an enormous cash cow for everybody in the media business. And you have to remember that the media had been, especially print media, but really everybody had been in a steady decline for a long time. So people who worked in the business, we were very accustomed to the idea of the pie was going to be shrinking steadily for us going forward. And all of a sudden in 2015 and 2016, everybody was very conscious that we were making a lot of money all of a sudden. And a lot of the reporters who were covering Trump started to talk about this internal conflict they had. They thought, well, we're making a ton of money by covering this guy. If you go back and look at the statistics, you'll see that, for instance, Bernie Sanders got 23 times less coverage than Donald Trump did on cable television in 2015 and 2016, even though they were fairly similar stories in terms of the challenging the established framework of their parties. So I think what happened to a lot of these news companies is they didn't want to have to face up to their friends and to their benefactors and say, we enabled Donald Trump, that we helped him get elected, which I think they would say they probably did do, especially in the nomination phase. They gave him a lot of free media. There's the famous story of the cameras rolling on CNN when there's an empty podium, maybe when Trump hadn't even spoken yet. They thought to themselves, well, what can we do? We don't want to be accused of helping him. But we don't want to stop covering him either because it's making us so much money. So the solution they hit on was, let's just cover him more, but be more negative about it. And so they presented it in columns like the Rutenberg column as an ethical decision. Whereas I think in reality, it was a business decision. And you can see this borne out, particularly in the way, like for instance, the New York Times shifted its coverage. They went from being a newspaper that relied heavily on subscriptions, newsstand subscriptions, newsstand sales, and advertising, to being really, really reliant on digital subscriptions. So they went from, I think it was like 1.5 million subscriptions in 2016. They now have like 7 million subscriptions. They're the world's largest digital subscriber base, which means they're catering to a specific audience as opposed to trying to reach a broad audience across the country. And you're able to do that being sharply negative about Trump and not worrying about the rest of the country, even though they recognize that they got the story wrong and they called it incorrectly. They don't worry about that because they're making a lot of money doing what they do.
This might be a minor point, but somewhat Trump related, but not entirely, that I thought was interesting in 2016, which was, there was this debate between President Trump and between then candidate Trump and candidate Hillary Clinton, and she mentions, kind of forces an answer into a question that was kind of weird. And it dealt with this woman named Alicia Machado. And Alicia Machado had been like a Miss Universe of some kind, like many decades prior. And she introduces this concept that Donald Trump had been mean to Alicia Machado. And that night, multiple media outlets had full color like photo spreads of Alicia Machado with stories ready to go. And what was interesting to me about it was that I can't remember, one reporter says, should we mention that the Clinton campaign is the one that set us up with this, with all that we needed to do to run this information operation? And everyone was like, yeah, it's fine, don't worry about it too much. And it became this model that we then see used over and over again where, someone launders opposition research through something legitimate, like a debate or something like that, and then it's like artificially injecting into the news story, into the news cycle, and the people who are supposed to be out there getting the news just receive and regurgitate it. And I just thought that was interesting when it happened, and then it starts happening all the time.
Yeah. So there was a famous instance during the run-up to the Iraq War where, and Seymour Hersh wrote about this, he called it stovepiping, where Dick Cheney took raw intelligence that he liked about WMDs and fed it to the New York Times. The New York Times wrote a story about it. Meet the Press ended up doing a story about the New York Times story. And then Dick Cheney says, well, Meet the Press reports that this happened. So essentially he was laundering information through the news agencies, which had to know what he was up to. And this pattern, which was sort of unusual and unethical, right? Now that happens constantly. When we saw it regularly in 2016, not just with the Machado thing, but looking back with the Michael Isikoff story about Carter Page being a foreign agent and a conduit to the Kremlin. If you remember, there was a story in Yahoo News that this former Trump aide had been, that there was an intelligence officer who was saying that he was a conduit between the Trump campaign and the Kremlin. And then as soon as that story came out, the Clinton campaign issued a tweet and a press release saying, oh, this is really horrible. And nobody disclosed that they had actually been the source for that story, right? And this has become kind of a common thing. There was once a time probably when you would have felt ethically obligated to disclose something like that, and now they're just kind of like, nah, it's done.
So what has changed that journalists' ethical standards have gone in this direction, or all but disappeared, it seems?
I'm still, if I can just keep rolling with this, one of the things I thought was interesting, last week there was this indictment of one of the sources that was used for the Russia collusion hoax. And in that indictment, it starts talking about other people who were involved, including someone who's identified as PR Executive 1, first name something, last name Dolan. Charles Dolan. And one of the things that was interesting about that fact is that Charles Dolan had been previously identified as like a very highly connected Clinton source who had been meeting with media outlets about some of this information. And it's just sort of scandalous to me that while independent journalists like Matt and myself are trying to unravel this whole Russia collusion hoax. The people who are winning Pulitzers for their participation in the hoax actually understood far more about the PR operation. They were meeting with these people. They knew who these people were, and had access to all that information and chose to withhold it from the American people when they had to have known, even if they were total idiots for years, like 2 years, who didn't realize that they were being useful tools of this operation. They had to figure it out at some point, and then they still withheld that information. And I think that's just, like, there should be career consequences for that. So what has changed? I don't know. Everyone's doing it.
I mean, I used to cover finance, so after the 2008 financial crisis, I spent a lot of time covering the fallout from that, so I did a lot of financial reporting. And it's a kind of a typical pattern for, let's just say, a hedge fund that has bet against a company. They might do basically the equivalent of an opposition research report. They'll hire an investment bank to do a report on a company, and then they'll try to get an agency like the FBI or the SEC interested in the investigation. They will pass that report to that official body. Then they will go to a reporter and leak the news that this company is under investigation. The reporter then writes the story saying that the company is under investigation. The stock goes down, they cash out, everybody wins. So the reporters know what the game is, right? In that instance, but the reason ethically that they were always willing to do that is they had to at least check to make sure that the information they were given was real. So sometimes those stories turn out to be important stories. Like Enron was a story that was broken that way by sort of opposition research by short sellers. But this is an example of the Russia story was one where a lot of the people who were involved, they knew they were being given opposition research, and they never disclosed exactly where it was coming from, even when it became really highly newsworthy for them to do so. And it wasn't until October of 2017 that we found out officially that this stuff came from, for instance, the Steele dossier came from the Clinton campaign. So that means at least 9 news organizations sat on that information for over a year, which you really have to wonder about, like whether that's ethical or not.
I do think it's interesting the effect that particular story has had on the perceived credibility of corporate media. And I always find it interesting to talk to people about when or if they lost trust in the media. And everyone has a different example of it. There's this great essay by Michael Crichton on skepticism where he talks about how kind of gullible news readers are. He calls it the Gell-Mann amnesia effect, where you read a story in a newspaper about something you know very well, and the story is complete bunk. Like cause and effect is reversed, they didn't talk to the right people, they're missing key parts of information. And then you turn the paper and you turn the page of the paper and you totally believe whatever the next story is. And it seems like that was what was happening for a lot of people. They might know that the media weren't completely credible, but they generally believed them, and they had this amnesia about how bad they were with certain stories. There would be really dramatic failures, like Dan Rather, on the eve of one of George W. Bush's elections with his story about the National Guard that was blown up, or people might have, I think the Duke lacrosse case was very meaningful for people. The way the media handled reports of weapons of mass destruction in the march to the Iraq War. So everyone has their own moment when they lost trust, but it does seem like this story has done so much to destroy media credibility. And the weird thing about it is, like, everybody knows it, but the media, who keep operating as if everything's just totally fine and just operating as normal, and they keep doing things the way that they were without realizing that they have lost the confidence of a huge portion of the country.
I guess one question is why? Why do they continue to think that they can operate in this way and not see that this is having such a negative impact on your profession and on the country?
I think a lot of it again goes back to this idea of the changed idea of what the role of the media is. My father was a news reporter, and back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, people who came up in the business, again, they had this idea that the role of the press was, to be as accurate as possible, get you the information that was as faithful to reality as possible, no matter, let the chips fall where they may. And it was the public's job to sort out what they did with that information. And then there was this really big change in how we viewed what our jobs were. And I'm very politically liberal, but I come from a traditional reporting background, so this idea of doing things in this highly politicized way is like kind of alien to how I was raised and how I was brought up to do the job. And I think what happens is when news organizations feel like they're directionally right, like they're hitting the right targets, but if they have an inaccuracy, it's not that important as long as they're hitting the right people. That's why they're being very forgiving to themselves when they make these errors. Whereas the reality is when you make mistakes and the public sees it, they just lose trust in you. They don't believe you anymore. So you're undercutting yourself. In addition to it being unethical, it's just ineffective. It's a very strange way of looking at the job.
I think, though, they haven't been made to suffer like they should.
Mollie's very into suffering.
So I was thinking about this. Well, I mentioned earlier today that the most recent Gallup poll on media credibility shows that 3 out of 4 Democrats generally trust the media to report their views fairly and accurately. 9% of Republicans report the same. So there's this huge gap in credibility based on which political party that you're in. But a couple of weeks ago, the Virginia Republican Party agreed to have a debate for their candidate, moderated by Chuck Todd. And Chuck Todd was a major Russia conspiracy theorist. He would berate his guests who had any skepticism about the Mueller probe. He advanced some of the most delusional ideas as part of the Russia collusion hoax. He just kind of asserted that that there was collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia. And he did this for years because he had a daily show and then also the weekend show. Does that Meet the Press? Yeah. So he had like a daily Meet the Press on MSNBC, a weekend that was more broadly watched. And the Republican Party decided he would be a good candidate or a good person to moderate a debate between their candidates. So why would he change what he's doing when there are no repercussions? Like, actual people might hate what happened at NBC and MSNBC, but apparently it's fine for the leadership of the Republican Party. And so long as they treat these people as they're acting in good faith and that they don't demand accountability for what was done, there's no reason to change what they're doing. I mean, they succeeded in convincing a huge portion of their viewing public and the country of something that wasn't real. It had negative political consequences for the people they don't like for years, and good political consequences for the people they do like for years. So why would they do anything differently? They got awards, they got money, they got more viewership. Like, what would be the incentive to change?
Yeah, I would also add, it's not, there have been similarly disillusioning incidents for people who are on the other side of the political spectrum. There was a moment in the 2020 presidential campaign when there was a debate that involved, Bernie Sanders and the rest of the field. Remember, there was a story about allegedly Bernie told Elizabeth Warren that a woman couldn't win the presidency. And the story was sourced to 4 people if you look at the CNN story, but actually it was one person who told 3 people who then told CNN. And in the debate, there's this amazing sequence where they ask Bernie about it first. The CNN moderators, they say, well, did you say this? And he said, well, no. And you can see me on camera 30 years ago saying a woman can and will win the presidency. I campaigned for Hillary Clinton when she won the popular vote. I only ran in 2016 when Elizabeth Warren decided not to run. And he goes through this whole thing, and the moderators say thank you, and then they turn to Elizabeth Warren and they say, Senator Warren, when Bernie Sanders said this, thank you. And that was very disillusioning for a lot of people who were kind of politically on the left. I think for the first time saw what a lot of conservatives had seen for years, which is that these actors are not impartial actors. Like they're taking sides, they're picking sides, and they're pushing things in a direction all the time in ways that they maybe didn't 10, 15, 20 years ago.
That story itself should not have run the way it ran, because as you know, the source was Elizabeth Warren and Elizabeth Warren's word that she gave to other people. According to the reporting itself, there were 2 people in that room.
Right.
Bernie and Elizabeth. And they asked Bernie, he said he didn't say it. Elizabeth says he did, and she told 3 people that he did. That's not 4 sources. That's what happens all the time with anonymous sourcing. Like my favorite example of this during the Russia collusion heyday was that someone from the House staff gave to CNN information that Donald Trump Jr. had secret access to something before WikiLeaks dropped it. And they said that this happened, and then they had 2 sources. And it would be explosive because this would be like the first evidence of anything that can even be tangentially tied to the Russia collusion narrative. And so they say 2 sources. Then people at other media outlets say they have confirmed this reporting, and that they also have anonymous but multiple sources to confirm this reporting. And it turned out that it wasn't true, that the email that Donald Trump Jr. had gotten, supposedly giving him early access to explosive WikiLeaks information, was in fact a random person emailing Donald Trump Jr. at a public email address days after a WikiLeaks thing had dropped to say, hey, did you see this thing that happened on WikiLeaks? That's literally all it was. But they had multiple sources that confirmed a date that was wrong. That couldn't have happened unless these 2, in my view, the 2 sources were sitting right next to each other in one particular office. They ran the operation of leaking this to people. They also were the people to confirm this from other media outlets. And it would have all been easily avoided if a reporter did, demand to see the email before he runs with it, or ask for independent confirmation. Independent means it can't be like you and your mom both saying the same thing. It has to be like 2 people who have come at it differently. And then yes, that happened. That was actually the word for word. Bernie, did you say this? No. Elizabeth, when Bernie said those words to you, how did you feel? It's just insane.
It was even worse than that. After the debate, the CNN panelists were sitting around talking. I forget who exactly said it, but one of them said, "Well, this is a confirmed story, and it's not a he said she said story," when it literally was a he said she said story. In one of my books, I talk about that exact phenomenon of taking one source that turns into 3 sources. I call them 4-source clovers, because especially with national security stories, it's very common to get one person who knows or has heard something, and then they will call a reporter, and the reporter will say, well, how do I confirm this? And they'll say, and the source will give you, well, here's 3 people you can call. Well, they all work in the same office, right? But they're all going to be anonymous, so the reader has no way to assess the quality of that information, and there's no way to independently reproduce sometimes what you're getting in these stories. An example would be like the New York Times did the story in, I think it was 2018, that just announced that America's spies in Russia had gone dark. Essentially, they had a high-ranking CIA source that had told reporters at the New York Times that they weren't hearing from their sources in Russia. Well, how does a New York Times reporter confirm that? Like, they're going to give phone numbers of the spies in Russia? Like, there's no way. So you have to be taking the word of these anonymous sources, and it's impossible to confirm this stuff. It's impossible for rival news agencies to confirm it. And this just goes on a lot more than we ever saw it previously.
So Matt, earlier you were talking about the economic incentives behind this kind of coverage. On the other hand, I think a lot of people who are consuming the media experience it as political bias or something along those lines. And so, Mollie, I wonder if maybe you could just comment a little bit more on the motivations behind this shift in the media. Do you see it as being economic, like Matt's saying? Do you see it as being political or grounded in some kind of ideological bias? Is it both and? Or?
So it's interesting. I came out of a straight news environment, although I've been doing opinion journalism for many years now. And my first editors were, I jokingly always called them communists. Like, they were crazy lefties, but you never knew it. Like, they never put it in anything. They never directed me to write a certain way. We would fight about it at the bar or at night. It was definitely that we all had strong political views, but the pressure was such that you really did not have, you had to suppress that. It would show up. I was someone who kind of got interested in media criticism because I noticed how they covered the abortion topic. When I was a kid, I noticed, oh, this is very biased. I mean, there's a great, David Shaw wrote this great lengthy 4-parter at the Los Angeles Times about the bias in abortion coverage and how, like, the source selection for different sides or the terminology that was used. And he himself was pro-abortion rights, but he was concerned about the way that was done. That was 1990, so long-standing problems that were legitimate. But I think what's happened in recent years is the guardrails are off for all of that. There's actually an incentive to put your bias into stories. You've had newsrooms built around encouraging bias. You have journalism schools which produce reporters encouraging more viewpoint expression. And then the thing that I personally love but is very bad for media credibility is Twitter, in which like Donald Trump never had an unexpressed thought that didn't like that's kind of Twitter for journalists. They just tell you constantly what they're thinking about stories and how they're going to shade something. And as an observer, I find it very helpful to watch. I do not think it's good for them. I actually, if I was running a news company organization that was trying to have legitimacy across multiple viewpoint perspectives, I might ban people from being on social media. So I think there are a lot of reasons why we've had problems, but there's no pressure to avoid there's no pressure to avoid bias.
Yeah, I think journalists have always been sort of overwhelmingly, I think, left-leaning. In my experience, growing up, most of the people I knew who worked in media voted Democrat. There were very few sort of open Republicans in media, but it didn't come out so much. And there were a lot of people who worked in media whose political beliefs you could keep secret. Like it wasn't a necessary part of your job to tell people what your political views were. When the New York Times dismissed their last public editor, Liz Spade, in 2016, one of the things that one of the complaints was that she had talked about the newspaper's social media policies, that the reporters were on social media essentially too much. I think, if I'm remembering correctly, that was her complaint. And the reason for that this was an issue is that back in the day, the New York Times, you would see a reporter's byline and just not know a whole lot about that person, except that they worked for the New York Times, which had a certain, allegedly a certain reporting standard. Now it's basically impossible to work in media and have people not know exactly where you stand on almost everything. Reporters are all editorialists or all op-ed writers, even if they're straight news writers, which is a major difference. Like my father wrote 2 editorials in his entire 50-year career in journalism. You couldn't do that these days. It's impossible. And I think a lot of that, again, has to do with the economics of the business now. It's just different how we structure it.
So you've, building on that a little bit, you've mentioned a few times the idea of objectivity or having some kind of standard. And I'm wondering, from both of you, maybe Mollie, you could go first. What do you think the appropriate sort of standard of conduct is for a journalist? Because I think, some people would say even this older standard of objectivity, that there is ultimately an impossibility to that, perhaps, like you can strive for that, but that at the end of the day, everyone's going to, maybe see something from a biased perspective or something along those lines. So I wonder, do you think objectivity is the standard? Do you think that's something that can be achieved, ever, or especially today?
Right, so there was that period of time where American journalism aimed toward objectivity. We're no longer there, but we weren't always there to begin with. We used to have much more partisan press. I think that at its best, it was not a belief that one could be objective so much as that one should aim for that. And people understood that human nature being what it was, it would never be completely successful. But I think like the whole word has been polluted because it's such a joke now. So I think that what's important to do is aim to be telling true and accurate information and getting a variety of viewpoints. I actually think having personally outsider views can help you do that better. Sometimes the biggest danger is when you think your viewpoint is shared by everybody or by enough prominent, or like a large enough group of people, you just kind of try and shove it through. Sometimes having real outside views, you can look and sort of see the horizon and see all the different perspectives and report on them. Just report on what some of the different ideas are. It just totally depends on whether you're doing straight news stories for a small issue or large expansive features. And this is another one of those economic issues. The journalism industry has changed so much from where you used to be able to write like a humane amount of words a day, and now so many reporters, as they're being brought up, have to write, like they have to just like shove out many articles a day. It makes it so that they don't learn a beat particularly well. They don't learn the variety of viewpoints on that are affecting the beat they cover. But it so depends on whatever type of journalism you're doing. But I do think being honest and accurate, and more than anything, I think being skeptical of what everybody tells you. Like, I didn't go to journalism school, but it was one of those first things that one of my first editors explained to me about being skeptical of literally everything that you're given. When someone comes to you with information in particular, you need to nail down why they're coming to you with that information as best as possible. Even the best good-hearted people who want to expose wrongdoing have some kind of motivation that you need to understand to help you avoid the pitfalls that come. Like, the number one thing you should ask if an intelligence source is trying to get you to publish something is like, I better have a good handle on who they're trying to screw here, why they're trying to get this out. And that is like completely missing. I think people now just think they're part of a political team and they need to get that message out.
Yeah, I think objectivity, as you mentioned, before the mass media age, before Hearst papers, and most newspapers in America were very partisan, I think. But then we developed this thing that we now think of as the objective standard. When I did research on this, I looked stories about people like Lowell Thomas, who was he was sort of the famous newsreader. If you look at the old newsreels from World War II, he was the guy who was the voice of a lot of those newsreels. And he had the first really popular national radio news program in the 30s. And Thomas was a really interesting guy. He was a one-man performer. He had traveled with Lawrence of Arabia and did like a stage act about it. And he wanted to make the news very theatrical. He actually noticed that just telling people news events stirred up all kinds of emotions, including anger. And he wanted to write a book called Making Millions Angry when he first started doing his news reports. But the sponsors of CBS radio at the time told him that they didn't want him to go in that direction because they wanted to get the widest possible audience. So they told him to, quote unquote, play it down the middle. And he developed that kind of monotonal voice that survived for 5 or 6 decades, that Dan Rather / Walter Cronkite sort of detached anchor person voice. So it was sort of a commercial strategy when he brought it to the fore. The problem now, when you hear people talk about the objectivity standard, they'll say, "Oh, well, it's wrong because." What really they were telling reporters to do is give equal weight to things that weren't equal. And the classic example they always bring up is if you're doing a story about climate change, you'd talk to a legitimate scientist, and then you would talk to an oil and gas industry scientist who would be skeptical, and the two things weren't the same. So if you put them side by side, you were deceiving the reader. So it's more important to show people what you think is actually true versus just reflecting both sides. I don't think that's really what objectivity is about. I think it's more what Mollie's talking about. It's an aspiration to be accurate and fair. So when you're covering a story, you have to try to punch holes in everybody's point of view. You have to clean your slate every time. So if you've done a story before, but you have to do the same one again with some of the same characters, you have to forget what you learned last time and start over and test your hypotheses over and over again, sort of like a scientist does. And just ask a lot of questions of different people. And that's just being honest. It's not a formulaic thing. It's not, 5 lines of Republicans and 5 lines of Democrats. It's just playing it straight and calling things as you see them. I think that's what the aspiration to objectivity really meant. So it's sad to see it completely disappear, even if it had flaws.
And also that brings up like the most interesting thing I think happening right now, where if you don't have a dominant viewpoint, you're now actually getting taken off of media, sometimes by force. Like you're not allowed to express outsider viewpoints on YouTube or Facebook. And sometimes those outsider viewpoints, I think all viewpoints, I think that if you disagree with someone, you should just compete with them in the world of ideas and tell them why they're wrong if they're wrong. I don't believe in coming up with like information that you're not allowed to even traffic in at all. But what's particularly interesting about a lot of what's been taken off of social media by big tech oligarchs is that frequently the information that is supposedly not true and a threat is in fact true. So whether they're saying you can't discuss the likelihood that coronavirus came from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, or something of that nature, even if that weren't true and it's likely true, it still should be allowed to be discussed, and you should be able to compete against it in that marketplace of ideas. That's not happening, and people are taking their cues because they're so reliant on social media for traffic. They're taking their cues from these censors, these very powerful censors about what can and can't be discussed. And that's not good for people, civil discourse, the country.
Mm-hmm. No, we were talking, there seems like there's maybe some overlap there between what's happening in the media and what's happening on college campuses in terms of, people feeling like only certain kinds of views can be expressed, which leads to self-censoring. I think on college campuses, maybe a lot of that, there's economic pressures and professional pressures for faculty and that sort of thing, but there's also just the overarching social pressures as well. So it seems like in the media, journalists are experiencing these kinds of economic pressures. You could actually be shut down if you're not saying the right kinds of things, but I imagine there's also social pressures in terms of just your fellow journalists and the people that you interact with and that sort of thing.
Absolutely, yeah. No, there's a huge social pressure to conform now that never existed before. One of the reasons I was attracted to the job is because I grew up around journalists, and I really liked the way they were independent-minded. There was a lot of joking, like being in a newsroom was like being in the back of a comedy club when I was growing up. It was very loose. They were very willing to entertain different kinds of viewpoints. They had a kind of a jaded way of looking at politics, and there was absolutely no pressure to conform to be like other people in the newsroom. Like that just was an alien concept. Now it's completely different, and people are really afraid to step out of line because there can be pretty severe social and professional consequences. Just to give you an example, like last summer during the protests after George Floyd's death, there were a lot of reporters I knew who were, again, very socially liberal, I would say, or politically liberal. Even people who had written a lot about police brutality, but they wanted to cover certain aspects of the story about the protests, like the damage that was being done, like the fact that the sort of that there was some violence, and they were getting pressure from inside their newsrooms to not go near those topics, which is just not how traditional reporters would have handled it. They wouldn't have been afraid to put out things that were sort of counter-narrative. In fact, it would have enhanced the credibility of the reports to give some perspective on things. But there are a lot of people who work in newsrooms, especially at like the lower levels, like the younger reporters. For somebody like me, it's not, or Mollie, it's probably not such a big deal. But for like a 25-year-old reporter who's just starting, like if you're really going to be the one who steps out of line, that it could be the end of your career pretty quickly now.
I even think, since we were talking about 2016 and I'm in right of center media, I thought it was really interesting how conservative media handled the 2015-2016 primary, where nearly every single major conservative publication came out and asserted there's no way you can vote for Donald Trump. And then, of course, he wins the nomination. And so it becomes, that becomes also a source of a disconnect in trust between these publications and their readers. And running one of those publications myself, and a bunch of us being in DC, we were just as mortified as anyone when Trump came on the scene. But we had built the Federalist intentionally to avoid DC groupthink. So we didn't have at that time any office at all in DC, but we had intentionally put people around the country, and we sought writers from around the country. We didn't like how in so many journals and magazines in DC and New York based, they always had the same writers over and over again. And we thought that had created this stagnation and lack of fresh ideas and perspectives, and also not enough different people writing who weren't full-time writers. So we have this model where we have hundreds of people from across the country submitting things and writing things, and they were all much more open to Donald Trump than we were. And we were able to kind of learn from that, where we would say, we would write our pieces about how this is the worst thing that ever happened or whatever, and then we'd have all these submissions from other people who were explaining to us what was very important for us to know and that we couldn't have known without being embedded in the rest of the country. And it was very helpful, and it also tells you what's lost by the increased nationalization of the media.
Yeah, that was an amazing story. If you go back and look at the analyses by mainstream news organizations in 2015, not 16, but 2015, when Trump was already way ahead in the polls, you'll see predictions by sort of all the biggest news agencies that it was impossible that he could win the nomination. 538.com, which is Nate Silver's site, which became famous for accurately predicting the results of the 2008-2012 elections. They did a story essentially saying that Donald Trump would play in the NBA before he became the nominee of the Republican Party. And part of the reason for all this is because the way that the campaign is structured, you only spend time with the candidate and the people on the plane, and you spend relatively little time talking to actual people. And so the campaign is kind of like a flying prison. You're just sort of touring around the country, hanging around with the aides and the candidate, and you're always, and especially once the Secret Service is involved, you never get out, you never actually talk to people. That's how everybody missed this story. And the fact that everybody screwed that up, and they didn't have a moment where they took stock and thought, wow, there must be a big structural flaw in what we're doing, is kind of amazing and speaks to how dysfunctional it's become.
So I do want to open this up to questions, but one last question before we do. Besides reading the Federalist and TK News, do you have advice for consumers of media? I think obviously, as we've talked about, trust in the media has seriously declined. I think a lot of times people don't know what to believe, and that is sort of having a ripple effect throughout our society in general. But just in terms of people who are trying to understand what's actually going on and get an honest grip on things, do you have any advice on how they can consume media to be sure that they're at least having a chance to get accurate information?
I do have some thoughts on that. I think it's important to find voices you trust and to support them. And I mentioned earlier, I do subscribe to Matt's Substack, and I subscribe to Glenn Greenwald's Substack, and it just cracks me up because I'm not politically where they are, but I find such value in reading what they have. And there are a few others that I just reporters who I know are going to report important information accurately, even if I don't share some of their perspectives. And I also use Real Clear Politics, which is it's like a news aggregator. They also do their own reporting and investigative reporting in particular, which I very much appreciate. But they have each day an aggregation of polls, which I find interesting. And they also have good historical data on polling, so you can kind of know how much to trust a poll. My favorite thing, the Washington Post said that Joe Biden would win Wisconsin by 17 points. So every time I see a poll from Washington Post or ABC, I just subtract 17 points. Just kind of say, oh, that's an interesting poll. But they also do like a daily aggregation of news from across the political spectrum, because I think we all like to read or hear arguments that match our own, but you have to force yourself to hear different arguments, and so it's a good way to get a survey of arguments from different sides of the political spectrum. But mostly just find those voices that you like, follow them, and then do your own reporting. I know that's like you don't have time to do that, but sometimes you get enough information that you can think critically about the information you're getting or test something out. Just check something like, they said this, go read the original document and say, did that person accurately describe this document or this meeting? And then just stick with the people who do it accurately.
Yeah, I would just second what Mollie said. The big structural flaw in modern media is that everything is siloed. So when, let's just say, center-left media or the Washington Post or the New York Times, when they make a mistake, they're not going to highlight their own mistakes. So you're only going to find those mistakes reported on in conservative media, and the converse is also true. Unfortunately, like so I think you have to make a concerted effort to try to read news from both arenas and get out of your own comfort zone. Especially big tech and Silicon Valley, their entire business model is geared around creating an individualized news experience for you that is based on sending you stuff that they know you're going to like. So you have to make a conscious effort to avoid the stuff that's being sent at you all the time and step out of your own comfort zone. Go to primary sources because those are easier to find than ever. You can find congressional documents, you can find primary source documents, court documents, and then in an extreme case, you can pick up the phone and just call yourself. Like I had this experience where I remember the story about the alleged change to the Republican convention platform, and I found all the reports so unreliable about that story. This idea that Donald Trump had changed the platform to be soft on Russia. Like the reports all seemed like they were inaccurate or missing elements. So I just started calling the people who had been quoted in the story as a news consumer, to find out whether any of this stuff was true. Unfortunately, I think people have been reduced to that. Like they're going to have to start being their own reporters, for a while. So.
All right, great, thanks. Well, We have just under half an hour left, so I think we can open things up to questions from the floor now. And I think maybe the best way to do that is to pass this mic to people, or?
People might be able to, if you can be loud enough, to project so that they're able to hear everyone okay without microphones, just call people and make sure that what you get repeated into the microphone.
May I ask a question essentially unrelated to the topic at hand? So I was reading a bit about you, Matt, and I think one of the things that stuck out was an article from years ago. That's the 52 funniest things about the upcoming death of the Pope. Can I ask a little bit about the fallout from that and kind of how it happened?
Well, yeah, I mean, it was obviously supposed to be satirical, and it was designed to be offensive, and there was a strong reaction to it. There were members of Congress who wanted to take every single newspaper. In fact, some of them did. They went and gathered up copies of our newspaper and threw it in the trash, which is actually illegal. But I was actually trying to lampoon the way that the news, the media responds to the death of famous people. They always go overboard in talking about everybody's positive qualities. Like, for instance, when Colin Powell recently passed away, and they often don't mention the negatives. So I was going in a different direction. I'm not sure it was the smartest thing to do, but that does happen. Yeah, for sure.
Well, I appreciate the question since we're at a Catholic institution.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah.
Getting back on topic, we'll go to Jim up here.
So I have a question, just curious, thank you both for being here. The Let's Go Brandon incident, just curious your thoughts on, do you think there's any way that they finally jumped the shark on just how crazy this all is?
I think that story is fascinating, and one of the things that I find fascinating, so is everybody familiar with the Let's Go Brandon chant, that a sideline reporter at a NASCAR race or something, heard a crowd saying not Let's Go Brandon, but something very inappropriate. And I'm glad I've already told my daughter about this this year. So she says, and she's talking to this guy named Brandon, she's like, do you hear them cheering for you? Let's go Brandon. And so now that's a much more palatable way for Americans to express their dislike of the current administration without using an actual vulgarity. So I'm fascinated by this. I think it's like just great and feels very almost like Dadaist, great political theater. But the left, as Matt has cataloged, has gotten so upset about the use of the phrase "Let's go, Brandon." This is just years after we heard horrible, vile things about the previous president that were celebrated by many in the media, that were participated in by many in the media, but now it's somehow horrible to clean up the phrase when it's against the other person. But one of the things I thought was really interesting about it when I talked about it on TV and I said something, a bunch of the people responded that I didn't understand that the Let's Go Brandon variation is not just a way to express dislike of the current administration or one-party rule in BC. It is also a way to show mocking contempt of the media because of and I hadn't really thought about it. I sort of thought this is like a nice way to say a political phrase, but that is why the media I think have reacted so negatively because well, not just caught, but like it's mocking them and they're not used to being mocked by the general public. The people who are doing this chant, I heard the less clean version at like a wrestling thing this weekend. But the people doing the chant aren't who you'd normally consider political actors. And it's become just part of the zeitgeist, like this fun thing that crowds do, and they're not used to being considered so uncool that they're mocked. So I don't know if that answers like the jump the shark thing, but it seems like
it was more like we finally got to the point of absurdity that, to your point, like they're getting called out on it and might actually have some sort of.
Well, what's so funny is that they're the only people who don't get the joke. So there was a tweet, there was an incident where a Southwest Airlines pilot said, and so there was half the people who work on CNN and MSNBC now used to work in the FBI or CIA, and there was one of them is a ex-FBI agent named Asha Rangappa, and she tweeted what would happen if an airline pilot got on and said, long live ISIS? The plane would be immediately grounded, everyone would be she's comparing it to a terrorist act, right? And this is after, Robert De Niro did his Tony Award speech where it was F Donald Trump, and Samantha Bee did her thing with, Ivanka, and Jim Gaffigan did one, and in Los Angeles, there was an F Trump art show, right? Where you had like 250 entrants or whatever it was. And this was all celebrated in the op-ed pages, like, we're finally taking the gloves off. And now I think what people are doing is they're doing this G-rated version of that as a burn on the media. And the only people who don't get it are the news media, which is hilarious, I think.
I just have a question. Is the demise in journalism, loss of ethics and declining ethics and the loss of objectivity that we've discussed, is that unique to domestic journalism, or is that on the international front as well?
That's a great question. So I spent the first 10 years of my career reporting in Russia, and I think foreign correspondents have far fewer of these pressures to deal with. They're not in a newsroom. They tend to be alone. If there's an office they work in, it's only got a couple of people in it. Their editors really don't know the story, so they have to trust the reporters. Whatever they send back to the office, most of the time the editors have to go with it anyway. So I don't think they have to deal with it nearly as much, unless it's something that's heavily intertwined with domestic politics, like the Russia story.
So it's more our culture.
I think so.
Though I don't think they had quite the groupthink about objectivity that we did. So I think they had, it's totally going to depend on which country you're talking about, but more partisan press like we had prior to the middle of the previous decade.
Oh, you mean like in other countries? I thought you meant like foreign.
I sometimes like to turn on BBC. Well, I like the accents, but
Yeah.
I also find the news, it seems to just be a little more international, of course, but also the news of America just seems to not have a slant or a bias.
Really? It does.
They're a little, yeah, they're.
They all do, but I just find it's like a nice, in widening my circle.
Very
and
civilized
hearing things, I
bias.
just find that.
Sounds nice.
Civilized bias. Curious, just curious on these
Bias with an
international.
accent.
I think a lot of the same phenomena are going on in other parts of the world, but the foreign reporting on America, if you're like a foreign business person and you're investing in the United States, you actually have to know the real story. So I think they do a better job. You're more likely to see a good report in Der Spiegel or the AFP or the BBC than about a run-of-the-mill American political story than you probably are here.
The young lady in the back.
So where do you think social media is headed going forward, and is there any way that you think this can probably be fixed?
That's a really big question. I really don't know. I think they have such power over what people are allowed to talk about and how they're allowed to talk about it, that they are a legitimate threat to the country and our belief in if you know the founding of the country, it's all about being able to search for truth, whether that's religious truth or other truths that are, we think about freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and the restrictions on these things are really a threat to that. So I think one of the problems politically is that, generally speaking, I think the Democratic Party generally is happy with social media censorship. They kind of want it more, so they're applying pressure on these companies for more censorship that helps them out politically. And then the Republican Party, the base is done with these tech oligarchs, but that the people in power still have this way of looking at things like they're private companies, there's nothing we can do. And so I'm not quite sure what the political solution will be, if there will be one, but I thought it was really interesting when they kicked Trump off of social media, that it seemed to raise, that some people in other countries were very concerned about the level of power they had. But what's happening about that, I don't know. Maybe we'll all be living in Facebooktopia here soon.
All right, in the back.
Oh, sorry.
Wait, which one?
You guys can arm wrestle for it.
Yeah, ladies first.
So I wanted to know if you think the media botching what happened with Trump, obviously, and then doing it again with Virginia and New Jersey, do you think they can get a clue and realize they don't have a read on real American people? And even Van Jones said it the other day, Democrats and the news media are just annoying. And it was the most honest thing I had heard from anybody in liberal media in probably the last 4 years. So do you think that that sentiment resonates and might pick up some traction and that they might have that inward look? Or do you think they're just gonna keep going with more cowbell?
I mean, Matt will say something very positive, and I have given up hope that anyone in, like, that the larger picture in corporate media will improve. I assume that they will just decide that the problem, the flaw was that they didn't do enough. Now, I'm not sure if they were so bad in Virginia and New Jersey relative to what we're talking about with 2016. They begrudgingly started covering these issues in Virginia, where I'm from, where definitely it was a real thing. I live in a very liberal neighborhood, and the parents were putting up Youngkin signs. It was very weird to see in my neighborhood. And the local paper, the Washington Post, just kept asserting it wasn't real, wasn't happening. You had that debate, actually the one that I was complaining about with Chuck Todd, where Terry McAuliffe says parents shouldn't have a role in education. And the Washington Post didn't really cover it, like, at the level they should have, and they kept making this just be about critical race theory, when it's really not just about critical race theory. That is one of the issues that I think is real and legitimate, but a lot of it was about school closures during COVID, or masks, or Zoom schooling, just in general. I think because of the shutdown, parents saw what was happening in government schools, and they became alarmed across a whole range of issues. And the Post just wasn't covering it until it was too late for their guy, and then they kind of scrambled and tried to just say, like, it wasn't as big of a deal. But I assume they'll just figure out something and do it better. But you should give up hope that they will get better. That's that once you give up hope, you actually start dealing with the real situation and think about how to work around them.
Yeah, I think, after 2016, there were meetings at all these companies. Like the New York Times definitely supposedly had a meeting where they thought, how did we miss this? Like, we're the world's biggest news organization and we missed it by 50 miles, How does that happen? And their solution was they brought in one more conservative columnist, basically. And the degree to which these big companies are out of touch with what ordinary people are thinking is so massive that I agree. I don't think it's really bridgeable. The only thing I would hope is that somebody's going to come up with a different kind of model. Just in terms of who works in the media, there's such a difference. Like, again, once upon a time, there was always like a working class columnist in the newspaper, somebody who like hung out at bars and knew what construction workers and police officers and teachers, like the ordinary people, thought. There was always that kind of voice in the newspaper, and they slowly started to like eliminate those people from the news, and they're all like these professional class, upper class people now, and so they just don't know where these voting attitudes are coming from, and that's just a major failing. And there's a complete lack of like a certain kind of voice from media, and they would be well served to fix it, but I actually don't have hope that they're going to fix it.
All right, I'll go with one of the guys in the back now.
So I'd say headline gazing is pretty popular these days, especially in a fast-moving world. What I've noticed is like, it's started with more fringe news sources like, I guess, like Red State and like The Verge, and like Kamala Harris owns Mike Pence in debate, or Donald Trump slams Biden. These like really powerful words that seem kind of unprofessional in a way. I've seen these like coming more to like more mainstream sources like The Hill, CNN, Fox News, these bigger sources. So what do you think about the use of these like such, I guess, what I call unprofessional words in the headlines?
I mean, there are many reasons, like, agreed, headlines are blunt, and I would just note that this is what gets people to click. And I'm not saying that justifies doing it, but you can look in your own heart too and see whether you're demanding more nuance than something like that provides. The fact is, the vast majority of people only read headlines, and then like the next chunk is just like the top part, and most people don't have time to read the whole story, and that's just the reality of it. So don't be that kind of news consumer. Go ahead and seek out things that have, I mean, one of the saddest things about the internet is that it got rid of the punny headlines. Punny headlines were fantastic in the old days. Now we don't have them anymore because they don't match up with SEO and others.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to thank my fellow American citizens for being here and having a discussion about their ideas, whether or not they agree with them or not. It's thank you. We're a college university where the purpose is to learn about each other in a positive, different, diverse in ideas, and that's true diversity. The point I'm trying to make is, if you understand from your background covering the financial sector, then you know that there's SROs, self-regulatory organizations in the financial sector, as well as the SEC, deal with money. It doesn't fall into the First Amendment, but these organizations exist, and you know that these people can be held accountable, even when they play with the media. Now, I'm not suggesting that that should exist in the media. This is a conversation for both of you to have. They were just an idea that they have to be discussed now. Why don't we have something similar to that? That's not necessarily a question as it is an idea to be discussed at another time. And I know that the First Amendment is what people are trying to cling to. Oh, we're protected, so can the press. No, that's for reporting. This is the mainstream media. That's not the same thing. If it's dangerous and false, it is not protected by the First Amendment, and it's illegal. It's against the law. That person should be arrested and held accountable, especially when somebody else dies. If there is an immediate action that's caused for that, fire in a theater is one example. But how many times do we know that the press has incited people? It's not the press, the mainstream media has incited people. You know, at what point do you multiply that into propaganda and people die and their businesses go down the tube? At what point does somebody hold the mainstream media responsible? Again, this is just a general concept. And either one of you guys. Obviously, I'll make you the most, Mollie. You go first. I'm more than welcome to hear yours as well, and it doesn't have to be stopped now.
I think it's really interesting. I always like reading Founding Fathers, and Thomas Jefferson talks about how a free press is necessary for the preservation of liberty. He also said, if you want to know nothing, read a newspaper. Like, he was a great critic of the press, while also defending freedom of the press.
Absolutely.
And Ben Franklin had similar thoughts. I mean, it's kind of interesting to like read their nuanced take on all of these things. And I was mentioning earlier that I think it's really interesting that you've had a number of federal judges say that it's time to revisit defamation law, which is what you're talking about. So there are other things that are mentioned in the Bill of Rights that don't have the same protections that we currently have for the press. So like you have freedom of religion, but if you were to, harm someone in the practice of your religion, you might be held, liable. Or, like there are standards for negligence with doctors that we've had for a long period of time. Not that that's a First Amendment or Bill of Rights issue, but the press currently enjoy really extreme broad protections, and it's very difficult to go after them. And what's interesting about that is at the time the First Amendment was written, so like for instance, if you are a prominent person, you have almost no case you can make against the media because of the way the courts have interpreted the precedents there. But at the time the First Amendment was written, it was actually the opposite. You could get away with more defamation against a nobody than a prominent person. So it's kind of interesting to just think about that and whether that has been an improvement or not, or whether there should be changes. But the fact that Justice Thomas himself has said it's time to revisit it, and you had some prominent people at the DC Circuit say that, you've had federal judges in New York say it. So I think something is bubbling up here, and I'm kind of divided on it, because I really do believe that a free press that has as few restrictions as possible is good. And I might point out that Tocqueville also said that he thought like a plethora of newspapers was key to avoiding centralized government power. And that seems to be something that we need to always make sure we also have like a wide number or a big number of media outlets. But there's something that needs to happen. Something's out of whack, and I think there's public opinion moving toward having some kind of fix.
We've never had a formal media regulator in this country, and that was by design. I think the strength of the American system was the freeness of our press, right? And our reporters have always been we have a very strong tradition of bold, independent thinking reporting in this country. And what's been lost, again, it is true that it's very hard to sue a reporter successfully. However, it was once sort of a career-ending episode if you were successfully sued for libel. Like if you made that kind of a mistake that cost your company, it was usually not survivable for your career. And now it's just become a little bit too easy to make mistakes and get away with it. I worry a lot about creating a new bureaucracy that would sit on top of it, because that would, in a factual sense, that already exists with Facebook and Twitter and Google. That essentially they've become media regulators. They're pushing news toward you. They're pushing some material up and some material down, and that's too much power for any bureaucracy to have. So I understand your frustration, and there should be penalties for people who get things wrong. But I worry that there'd be more. It would end up being the cure would be worse than the disease if we had one.
So you've spoken about the economics and you've spoken about the incentives, and I'm curious what both of you have to say about membership. I think it's a huge part of the debate that's left out, because, and I'm glad that you brought up the BBC, but one of the main reasons that NPR is so trusted is because people pay membership and they identify themselves as an NPR member, and they wear the tote. They're like, I am NPR, right? So what incentive do I have as a reader to distrust anything that they say? And I wonder, especially with the switch to Substack, do you see any of that kind of inertia? Do you worry about it? Do you think, is membership the answer because it's independent, or is it going to fall eventually into those same problems?
I think there's definitely a danger of when you have a subscriber base of kowtowing to your subscribers. I think NPR has fallen into that, in a very serious way. Recently, I wrote a very short piece kind of criticizing NPR for their recent coverage, because it's become so one note in the last couple of years. I mean, it's so overtly political. And I was very shocked to hear from a number of NPR reporters after that who were like, yeah, go get them. Like, so I think, even within the cultures of some of these news organizations, it can be too easy to kowtow to your audience. And that's a problem with the subscriber model. And then you see it with the New York Times too. Like they're very wedded to that financial model, and it's had, I think, a really negative effect on their coverage.